She moved through the busy airport with a quiet confidence that came from years of experience. Her small suitcase rolled behind her, gliding smoothly across the polished floor. People moved around her in a rush, dragging their own luggage, talking on phones and keeping an eye on the screens showing flight departures. She never felt rushed. She had learned long ago that calmness often gave more control than hurried movements. Today she was traveling alone, heading to a family gathering she had been looking forward to for months. She had packed carefully, choosing a simple dress, comfortable shoes, and a scarf to match the mild autumn weather. Her hair was neatly done and her face carried a warm, welcoming smile. Despite her age, she walked with grace and dignity, each step measured and deliberate. As she approached the gate, she noticed the line of passengers already waiting to board. Some were reading books, others were scrolling on their phones, and a few were chatting quietly. She scanned the area, noting the faces around her. Her eyes, sharp and observant, missed nothing. She liked to take in her surroundings. It helped her feel prepared and aware. That awareness had served her well in life, especially in moments when others underestimated her. Today, she hoped, would be a simple, uneventful flight. She wanted nothing more than to reach her destination, enjoy the family gathering, and return home safely. She handed her boarding pass to the attendant at the counter. The young man glanced at it briefly, nodded, and handed it back. "Gate C12, he said, his tone neutral. She thanked him politely and made her way toward the gate, where passengers were already gathering. There, she was met by a flight attendant who seemed tense and impatient. The woman's intuition immediately sensed something off. This attendant's eyes lingered on her just a moment too long. Her smile seemed forced, and her body language carried a subtle tension. She brushed it off at first. Perhaps it was just the pressure of the job or the stress of boarding a crowded flight. She had encountered impatience and rudeness before, and had always managed to handle it with patience. The line moved slowly, and she patiently waited her turn to board. She noticed that some passengers gave her curious glances, but she ignored them. She knew that she carried herself differently from most elderly women. She did not ask for special treatment, did not complain unnecessarily, and never drew attention to herself. That, she thought, was perhaps why people sometimes stared. She had always preferred to focus on her own actions rather than worry about the opinions of strangers. Still, there was something in the flight attendant's expression that made her uneasy. It was a mixture of suspicion and annoyance, and she could feel it directed toward her. Finally, her turn came, and she presented her boarding pass again to the flight attendant. The attendant's eyes scanned the document briefly, then looked back at her. There was a slight frown, almost imperceptible, but she noticed it. "Are you sure this is your seat?" the attendant asked, her tone unusually sharp. The woman blinked, momentarily taken aback. She smiled politely and said, "Yes, I have checked my boarding pass. My seat is correct." The attendant's frown deepened and she muttered something under her breath, clearly audible enough to be heard by the woman. She did not react immediately. Instead, she remained calm, letting her composure speak louder than words. She had learned early in life that responding to anger with anger rarely solved anything. As she walked down the jet bridge toward the plane, she felt the stares of a few passengers. They seemed unsure of what to do. Some looked sympathetic while others looked uncomfortable. She appreciated the silent support of strangers, but she did not rely on it. She was used to handling difficult situations on her own. Boarding the plane, she moved slowly to her seat, carefully placing her bag in the overhead compartment. She noticed the flight attendant watching her closely, stepping slightly closer as if scrutinizing her every move. The tension in the air was palpable. She could sense that the attendant's impatience was more than simple job stress. It was personal. That realization made her heart sink slightly, but she quickly pushed the feeling aside. She had a long history of facing prejudice calmly, and she intended to do the same today. Settling into her seat, she adjusted her scarf and placed her hands gently on her lap. The cabin was filling with passengers, the hum of conversations blending with the sound of luggage being stowed. She took a deep breath, focusing on her own calmness rather than the subtle hostility around her. She had a lifetime of experience managing such moments, and she knew that patience and dignity often disarmed people more effectively than confrontation. Still, she could not ignore the sharp glance the flight attendant threw her way. It was a glance filled with judgment, as if the woman were an inconvenience in her day. She suppressed a sigh, reminding herself that this flight was not about proving a point. It was about reaching her destination safely and peacefully. As the plane doors closed and passengers settled, the flight attendant approached again. This time, her tone carried a sharper edge.
Ma'am, is there a problem with your boarding pass?
It says you are in 14B. Are you sure that's correct? The woman looked up calmly, her eyes meeting the attendant's. She replied with quiet firmness, "Yes, that is my seat. I have verified it multiple times." The attendant hesitated, frowning, clearly frustrated that the woman was not intimidated or flustered. Around them, other passengers were beginning to notice the tension. Some shifted in their seats, unsure whether to intervene, while others quietly watched the exchange with curiosity. The woman remained composed, knowing that any reaction from her could escalate the situation unnecessarily. The flight attendant's demeanor worsened, her impatience now openly visible. She muttered under her breath and walked away briefly, only to return moments later with a clipboard. She leaned over slightly, scrutinizing the boarding pass again. The woman looked around subtly, noticing the passengers who were beginning to take interest in the interaction. She took another deep breath and focused on maintaining her calm. She understood that people often judge situations based on appearances and behavior. By remaining composed and polite, she sent a clear message without saying much at all. She would not be treated unfairly, but she would also not escalate matters without reason. As the plane prepared for departure, the flight attendant continued to keep a watchful eye on her. The woman felt the tension, a silent, invisible weight pressing down, but she did not let it affect her outward demeanor. She looked out the window briefly, seeing the activity on the tarmac and the busy lives of the passengers around her. In that moment, she reminded herself that she was more than the judgment of one person. She had lived a full life, raised a family, achieved her goals, and earned the respect of those who truly mattered. This flight and this encounter were minor obstacles in the broader journey of her life. Her patience and dignity had carried her through far greater challenges, and they would carry her through this one as well. Finally, as the plane taxied toward the runway, she settled into her seat fully, adjusting her scarf and closing her eyes briefly. She could feel the subtle tension from the flight attendant even from a distance, but she allowed it to pass over her without disturbing her inner calm. Around her, passengers began reading, chatting quietly, or preparing for takeoff. The hum of the engines and the soft lighting of the cabin created a cocoon of relative peace. She focused on the journey ahead, on the family she was about to see, and on the knowledge that she carried herself with grace and dignity, no matter the behavior of those around her. The flight, she knew, would be long, but she was ready to face it with patience, composure, and quiet strength. The plane had reached cruising altitude, and the hum of the engines filled the cabin. Passengers began to settle into their routines, reading books, scrolling through their phones, or quietly chatting with companions. The elderly woman sat upright in her seat, hands folded neatly on her lap, her eyes calmly observing the cabin. She had learned long ago to remain aware of her surroundings, even in situations that seemed routine or mundane. There was a quiet dignity in her presence that contrasted sharply with the restless energy around her. She could feel the subtle tension still lingering from earlier, the invisible thread of impatience and bias that the flight attendant had displayed. She chose to ignore it for now, focusing instead on the gentle rhythm of the plane and the peaceful moments that came with flight. It wasn't long before the flight attendant approached her seat again. This time her approach was more deliberate, her steps slightly heavier. "Ma'am," she said, her voice tinged with annoyance, "your carry-on bag seems large for the overhead compartment. Are you sure it will fit?" The woman looked up calmly, her gaze steady and composed. "Yes, it will fit," she replied politely. "I have placed it carefully, and it does not exceed the allowed size." The attendant frowned, clearly frustrated that the woman was not intimidated. She leaned slightly, inspecting the bag with a scrutinizing eye as though trying to find any reason to criticize or control the situation. The woman, however, remained serene, letting the attendant's impatience reveal more about her than she did about herself. Around them, a few passengers had begun to notice the exchange. Some exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. The woman could feel their attention but did not rely on it. She had dealt with discrimination before, and understood that her strength lay in her own composure, not the reactions of strangers. She adjusted her scarf slightly and took a deep breath, letting the calmness within her radiate outward. It was a small act, but it carried weight. It signaled that she would not react with anger or fear, even as the flight attendant's behavior grew increasingly hostile. She had always believed that dignity was a quiet but powerful form of resistance. The flight attendant straightened up and muttered something under her breath. The words were barely audible, but the tone was sharp and cutting. "Excuse me?" the woman asked politely, her voice steady. The attendant glanced around, realizing that other passengers might have overheard her, and quickly composed herself. "Nothing," she said, forcing a tight-lipped smile. But the tension in the air remained. The woman could feel the subtle vibrations of hostility, the kind that came from prejudice and arrogance disguised as authority. She understood that this was not about rules or luggage. It was about power and bias, and she had encountered such situations many times before. She chose to maintain her calm, knowing that reacting with anger would only escalate the situation. As the flight continued, the attendant returned once more, this time with a clipboard in hand. She leaned over, scanning the boarding pass, the bag, and the woman herself with exaggerated attention to detail. "Are you traveling alone?" she asked abruptly, her tone carrying an edge of suspicion. The woman looked up, her eyes meeting the attendant's with quiet confidence. "Yes," she replied simply. "I am traveling alone today." The attendant's frown deepened. It was clear that she expected hesitation, fear, or some sign of discomfort, but there was none. The woman's calm composure and polite firmness only seemed to frustrate her further. Around them, passengers began to notice the subtle conflict, some shifting in their seats, others glancing at the interaction with quiet concern. The woman knew that her presence alone seemed to challenge the attendant in ways that were invisible to most people. She had faced bias before, subtle and overt, and she had learned the value of patience, dignity, and observation. She did not need to argue or raise her voice. Instead, she allowed her quiet confidence to speak for her. She knew that power often revealed itself in small, everyday moments, and she had mastered the art of maintaining it without confrontation. The flight attendant, on the other hand, seemed to grow more restless, her irritation increasing with every polite but firm response from the woman. The dynamic was tense, like a storm building quietly in the background. At one point, a passenger seated nearby leaned slightly toward the woman and whispered, "I saw that. That was rude of her." The woman smiled softly but did not respond directly. She appreciated the silent support, but remained focused on her own calm. She had learned that human reactions were unpredictable, and she preferred to maintain control over her own emotions. The presence of others did not dictate her response. Instead, she centered herself, grounding her patience in the knowledge that she had navigated far more challenging situations than this one. Her focus was on the journey ahead, on the destination, and on maintaining her dignity amidst unfair treatment. The flight attendant, clearly growing frustrated, began walking past her seat several times, each time casting a sharp glance in her direction. The woman felt the tension, a heavy, invisible weight pressing down on her, but she refused to let it disturb her peace. She adjusted her posture slightly, straightening her back, and let her calm energy fill the space around her. This was not an act of defiance, but a natural extension of her character. She had always believed that maintaining composure was not just about appearances. It was about protecting oneself from unnecessary conflict and asserting quiet strength. She had mastered this art over decades, and it served her well today. As the flight continued, the woman quietly reflected on her life and the lessons she had learned. She thought about her family, her accomplishments, and the resilience that had carried her through countless challenges. She had faced prejudice in many forms, both subtle and overt, and she had always emerged with grace. She knew that this moment, uncomfortable as it was, would pass. She did not allow anger or resentment to take root. Instead, she focused on her breathing, on the steady rhythm of the plane, and on the knowledge that her dignity was intact. The flight attendant's impatience, sharp words, and subtle hostility were temporary, but her composure and patience were enduring. At one point, the attendant leaned closer and said in a sharp whisper, "I hope you understand the rules. We have to follow them strictly." The woman met her gaze steadily. "I understand perfectly," she replied, her voice calm and even. "I have followed all the rules, and I am confident that I am in compliance." The attendant hesitated, clearly frustrated that the woman did not show fear or embarrassment. Around them, passengers quietly observed the interaction, some frowning at the treatment, others simply watching with curiosity. The woman allowed herself a small internal smile. She knew that by remaining calm and polite, she was demonstrating a quiet but undeniable power, the kind that did not need to shout or demand attention but spoke clearly through integrity and composure. As the flight attendant finally moved away, the woman exhaled quietly, letting go of the tension she had been holding. She knew that more challenges might come during the flight, but she was prepared. She had spent a lifetime developing patience and resilience, and she trusted in her own ability to navigate difficult situations. She adjusted her scarf, settled back in her seat, and looked out the window at the endless sky. The clouds moved slowly beneath her, calm and untroubled, a reminder that life, like the flight, continued forward despite obstacles. She allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection, appreciating the peace she could find even amidst tension and bias. The rest of the passengers had returned to their own activities, some casting occasional glances toward the woman and the attendant. She noticed the subtle shifts in their attention, the silent acknowledgement of the unfairness she was facing, but she did not let it influence her. Her focus remained on her journey, her dignity, and the quiet strength that had carried her through life. She knew that the world often judged individuals based on appearances and assumptions, but she also knew the power of quiet confidence and patience. The flight attendant, meanwhile, continued her rounds, her frustration barely contained, unaware that her behavior was being quietly noted by both passengers and crew. As the flight moved along, the woman considered the possibility that her son, a prominent figure in the airline world, might not yet be aware of the situation. She knew she could reach out if necessary, but she preferred to handle things quietly first. Her calm demeanor and quiet strength often diffused situations before they escalated, and she trusted in that approach. Still, she remained vigilant, aware that bias could appear in unexpected ways, and that maintaining composure was essential. The flight continued. Passengers settled into the steady rhythm of travel, and the woman quietly prepared herself for whatever challenges might come next, knowing that her dignity and patience were her greatest allies. The flight continued, the engines humming steadily as the plane cut through the sky. Passengers had mostly settled into their routines, some reading, others chatting softly or scrolling on their phones. The elderly woman remained calm, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her posture upright and composed. Despite the subtle tension from the flight attendant's earlier behavior, she maintained her quiet dignity. She understood that some people judged others before truly knowing them, and she had learned early in life that patience and poise could be the most powerful responses to unfairness. She watched the cabin with careful attention, noting small details, the way passengers shifted uncomfortably, the way the crew moved with purpose yet subtle tension, and the faint glances of disapproval toward the flight attendant from a few observant travelers. It was then that the attendant returned. Carrying a clipboard with a seriousness that seemed almost exaggerated, she leaned slightly toward the woman and said, "Ma'am, I just need to make sure everything is in order. Rules are rules and we have to follow them." The woman met her gaze calmly and replied evenly, "I understand completely. Everything is in order." There was no trace of fear, irritation, or defensiveness in her voice. She had long learned that reacting with emotion often played into the hands of those who sought to intimidate. Her calmness, quiet and resolute, was a form of resistance, a statement that she would not allow the prejudices of others to dictate her behavior or disturb her inner peace. Nearby passengers continued to notice the subtle confrontation. Some exchanged glances, uncertain whether to intervene or remain silent. A few quietly muttered among themselves, expressing empathy or disapproval. The woman appreciated the silent support but did not rely on it. She had learned that strength was cultivated within, not borrowed from the reactions of strangers. Around her, the cabin seemed almost tense, the subtle hostility of the flight attendant creating an invisible pressure. Yet the woman's serene presence contrasted sharply with the attendant's growing frustration. She allowed herself a small internal smile, recognizing the quiet power of her composure. As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, the woman reached into her bag and retrieved her phone. She discreetly checked a few messages and then made a call. She was calm, polite, and measured in her words. On the other end, her son, who held a prominent position as the airline's CEO, listened carefully as she explained the situation in a composed and detailed manner. She did not raise her voice or demand immediate action. Instead, she conveyed the facts clearly, emphasizing her experience and the inappropriate behavior of the attendant. Her tone was firm but controlled, reflecting the wisdom and patience she had cultivated over the years. She trusted that her son would respond appropriately, without unnecessary drama or confrontation. While she spoke, the flight attendant remained nearby, unaware that her actions were now under scrutiny, not only by the passengers but also by someone with significant authority within the airline. She continued her rounds, occasionally glancing at the woman, unaware of the connection that had quietly been established. The woman, meanwhile, remained composed, her voice steady, her eyes calm. She understood the power of observation and subtle influence. By maintaining her dignity and responding politely yet firmly, she had already begun to command respect without raising her voice or creating conflict. The flight attendant's impatience and bias were now quietly setting the stage for an inevitable confrontation. After finishing her call, the woman placed her phone back into her bag and took a deep breath. She leaned slightly back in her seat, allowing herself a brief moment of relaxation. The calmness she exuded seemed to influence the nearby passengers subtly. They noticed her serenity amidst tension, a contrast to the attendant's growing frustration. The woman's presence was a reminder that patience and dignity often spoke louder than anger or confrontation. Around her, small acts of empathy and recognition began to emerge. A passenger offered a polite smile. Another gave a subtle nod of acknowledgement. These quiet gestures reinforced the woman's inner strength, even as the attendant continued to patrol the cabin with a restless energy. The flight attendant returned once more, carrying a small notebook in which she seemed to be jotting down notes. She leaned toward the woman and asked, "Do you need any assistance?" "It's just that we have to make sure everyone is comfortable." The woman smiled politely, maintaining eye contact. "Thank you, but I am completely fine," she replied. "I appreciate your concern." The attendant's frown deepened, her frustration growing with each polite but firm response. She had expected compliance, discomfort, or even a trace of fear, but the woman displayed none. Around them, passengers watched quietly, some shifting nervously in their seats, others observing with quiet admiration. The tension was palpable, but the woman remained serene, her calm presence creating a subtle ripple through the cabin. At one point, a flight attendant colleague passed by and gave a quick, curious glance toward the woman and the persistent attendant. The subtle interaction did not go unnoticed by passengers, who began to murmur softly among themselves. It was clear to many that the woman was being treated unfairly, yet she remained calm and composed. She understood the dynamics of power and prejudice, and she chose her response carefully. Her voice, actions, and demeanor conveyed strength without aggression, patience without passivity, and dignity without arrogance. She had long mastered the art of standing firm quietly, allowing her presence and composure to speak volumes. The flight attendant, unaware of the woman's connection to the airline's leadership, grew increasingly tense. Her movements became sharper, her glances more scrutinizing, and her muttered comments slightly louder, catching the attention of nearby passengers. The woman, however, remained unshaken. She focused on her breathing, the steady rhythm of the plane, and the knowledge that she had faced far greater challenges in life. She reminded herself that true strength lay in maintaining composure when provoked, in responding with clarity rather than emotion, and in allowing patience and dignity to serve as the most effective form of resistance. Her calm presence quietly undermined the attendant's attempts to intimidate. Meanwhile, the woman reflected on the irony of the situation. Here she was, facing subtle hostility from someone who had no idea of her connection to the airline's leadership. She had raised a son who was now a prominent figure in the airline industry, yet she remained anonymous to the very person whose actions were causing her discomfort. She allowed herself a small private smile, knowing that the situation would soon shift. For now, however, she remained fully composed, observing, listening, and responding only when necessary. Her calmness was a deliberate choice, one that demonstrated her understanding of human behavior, authority, and the power of quiet confidence. Passengers continued to notice the subtle tension, exchanging small gestures of recognition, sympathy, or curiosity. The woman appreciated these quiet acknowledgments but did not rely on them. She had always understood that true strength was internal. By maintaining her composure and responding politely yet firmly to bias, she set an example not only for herself, but for those around her. The flight attendant, on the other hand, remained oblivious to the growing undercurrent of accountability, her frustration building with each polite refusal, each calm response, and each silent act of resilience displayed by the woman. The cabin atmosphere, once casual and routine, was now charged with a quiet tension that seemed to ripple through the passengers and crew alike. As the flight continued, the woman leaned back slightly, observing the world outside the window for a brief moment. The clouds moved gently beneath the plane, a soft reminder of the broader perspective she often carried in life. She allowed herself a moment of reflection, appreciating the patience, resilience, and wisdom that had guided her through countless challenges. She understood that this flight, though uncomfortable, was a small part of her journey. She had faced prejudice before, and she had always emerged with her dignity intact. Today was no different. Her calmness, observation, and quiet confidence had already begun to shift the dynamics of the cabin, setting the stage for the events that would soon unfold. Finally, as the flight reached a steady rhythm and passengers settled into the mid-flight calm, the woman felt a subtle shift in the air. The quiet acknowledgement of her composure by fellow travelers, combined with her own measured patience, seemed to influence even the restless flight attendant. Though the attendant remained unaware of the woman's connection to the airline's leadership, the tension had begun to evolve, creating a sense of anticipation. The woman, fully aware of her inner strength and the quiet power of dignity, prepared herself mentally for whatever came next. She knew that the remaining journey would bring resolution, and she was ready to face it with the same calm, composed, and confident manner that had guided her through life. The tension in the cabin had quietly built over the course of the flight. The passengers had begun to notice the subtle conflict between the elderly woman and the flight attendant. Some whispered quietly among themselves, sharing expressions of sympathy or frustration, while others simply watched, unsure how to intervene. The woman remained calm, her hands folded in her lap, her posture upright and her eyes serene. She understood that confronting prejudice with anger rarely worked, and she had learned over decades that patience, dignity, and quiet composure were often far more powerful. Yet she also knew that this situation might need more than just her personal restraint. It was time to take measured action. She reached discreetly into her bag and pulled out her phone. With a calm voice, she dialed her son, who was the CEO of the airline. She explained the situation in precise, composed words. She did not shout, did not raise her voice, and did not dramatize the events. She simply described the flight attendant's behavior, the subtle harassment she had endured, and the growing tension that was now visible to passengers around them. Her son listened intently, his tone respectful and concerned. "I understand, Mother," he said quietly. "Stay calm. I'll handle this immediately. We'll make sure this is addressed the right way." The woman thanked him and put her phone away, returning to her seat with the same quiet composure that had carried her throughout life. A short time later, there was a subtle commotion near the front of the plane. The flight attendant, still unaware of the connection between the woman and the airline leadership, was called to the front cabin by another crew member. The passengers noticed the tension in her steps, the slightly nervous gestures, and the sharp glances she threw over her shoulder. She returned moments later, her demeanor slightly changed, though still tinged with frustration. The woman remained calm, observing the subtle shift. She could feel the energy in the cabin beginning to change, an invisible acknowledgement that something significant was about to occur. She adjusted her posture slightly and took a slow, deep breath, grounding herself in patience and dignity. Soon after, the CEO, her son, arrived at the gate where the flight was preparing to land. He had been informed by the crew and had come directly to address the situation. His presence was quiet yet authoritative, commanding respect without the need for raised voices or overt confrontation. When he stepped onto the plane and approached the woman, he greeted her with a warm, reassuring smile. She returned the smile calmly, her inner strength unchanged. The flight attendant, still unaware of who he was, observed the interaction with curiosity and slight unease. She continued her rounds but seemed distracted, her previous air of control slightly diminished. The CEO quietly requested to speak with the flight attendant in a private space near the front of the cabin. He spoke with authority, yet his tone was calm and professional. The flight attendant's expression shifted from confusion to realization as she listened to his words. He explained that the passenger she had been harassing was his mother and emphasized the standards of professionalism, respect, and sensitivity expected from all crew members. The flight attendant's demeanor changed rapidly. Her confidence faltered, and her previous arrogance melted into visible discomfort. She realized that her actions, once dismissed as minor or insignificant, were now being held accountable at the highest level of authority. The cabin seemed to sense the shift. Passengers glanced around, some with relief, others with quiet admiration for the woman's calm resilience. After the conversation, the CEO returned to his mother's side. He spoke softly, reassuringly, but without condescension. "Mother, I'm here now. You don't have to worry. Everything is being handled." She nodded, her expression serene. "Thank you," she said calmly. "I knew it would be addressed properly. I just wanted to remain calm until help arrived." The CEO smiled, appreciating her composed demeanor. He understood that the woman's patience, dignity, and quiet confidence had already set the stage for a resolution. Her calm response had ensured that the situation was managed without escalation, preserving the integrity of all involved while clearly establishing accountability for the flight attendant's actions. The flight attendant, now fully aware of the woman's connection and the seriousness of her behavior, approached cautiously. She apologized in a controlled, professional tone, acknowledging the mistakes she had made and the inappropriate behavior she had displayed. The apology was formal, yet sincere, recognizing the impact of her actions. The woman accepted the apology gracefully, her demeanor unchanged. She understood that forgiveness, offered calmly and without anger, carried far more weight than any argument or confrontation. The passengers observed quietly, sensing a resolution that was both fair and dignified. The tension that had filled the cabin gradually dissipated, replaced by an atmosphere of relief and quiet respect. The CEO, still standing nearby, addressed the remaining crew briefly, emphasizing the importance of professionalism, respect, and empathy in all passenger interactions. His presence, calm yet authoritative, reinforced the standards expected of the airline staff. The woman observing the scene felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. She knew that the combination of patience, dignity, and careful action had brought about a resolution that was just and respectful. She did not gloat or boast. Instead, she allowed the calmness of the moment to speak for itself. The passengers, having witnessed the unfolding events, seemed to share an unspoken acknowledgement of her quiet strength and the effectiveness of her composed response. As the plane prepared for landing, the woman looked around the cabin. Some passengers smiled politely at her, others nodded in quiet recognition. The flight attendant, now subdued and respectful, moved efficiently through the cabin, no longer projecting arrogance or impatience. The woman adjusted her scarf, took a deep breath, and allowed herself to appreciate the resolution she had achieved through calm perseverance. The journey, which had begun with tension and subtle harassment, was now approaching a peaceful conclusion, demonstrating the power of patience, dignity, and careful action in the face of prejudice. Passengers quietly settled into their seats, preparing for arrival. The woman's composure had set a tone of calm professionalism throughout the cabin. She felt a quiet sense of relief, not just for herself, but for the passengers who had observed the events and learned in their own way about the importance of respect, empathy, and accountability. The flight attendant, now aware of the consequences of her behavior, moved with care and attention, ensuring that no further discomfort would arise. The woman, serene and composed, understood that her patience had not only resolved her own situation, but had subtly influenced the environment around her, creating a space where dignity and respect prevailed. As the plane touched down smoothly, the woman prepared to disembark. The passengers around her offered polite smiles, nods of acknowledgement, and small gestures of admiration. The flight attendant, once aggressive and impatient, now moved with professional care, ensuring that the final moments of the journey reflected the standards of the airline. The CEO accompanied his mother to the exit, maintaining a calm presence, reinforcing the resolution that had been achieved. The woman walked steadily, her steps measured and graceful, embodying the quiet strength that had guided her through the entire flight. The tension that had once filled the cabin had dissipated, leaving a sense of calm, respect, and closure. Finally, as she exited the plane, she felt a small but profound sense of accomplishment. The experience, though uncomfortable, had been handled with patience, dignity, and strategic composure. She had faced prejudice calmly, allowed her quiet strength to influence the situation, and ensured that justice was served without anger or conflict. Her son, the CEO, had intervened when necessary, but it was her own calm confidence that had set the tone for the resolution. The passengers, having witnessed the events, had seen a powerful example of how patience, dignity, and quiet strength could overcome bias and harassment. The woman walked through the terminal with her head held high, her calm demeanor reflecting a life lived with wisdom, resilience, and grace.